So looking at Charles Darwin a little bit more, since we're talking about evolution, the mechanism or how evolution occurred came through Darwin. The idea of evolution, and now they didn't use the term evolution, it was transmutation of species was how they described it, or the changing of species. Darwin was the first to give a plausible explanation for how that happened. He actually has an interesting history. He first went to the University of Edinburgh because his family was a very wealthy family. They were related to the Wedgwood family, if you've ever heard of Wedgwood pottery. In fact, Darwin married his cousin, Emma Wedgwood. So they were a very wealthy family, and his family was a line of doctors. His grandfather was a doctor, his father was a doctor, and we'll talk a little bit more about Darwin's family as we go along here. And his dad decided that, well, young Darwin needed some focus in his life, so he would send him to the University of Edinburgh to train to be a surgeon, just like himself. And young Darwin really didn't like college very much, was not a very good student, and he went to his very first observation of an operation, and it was actually an operation on a child, and he simply couldn't take it. This was before anesthetics. They're doing an operation on a conscious child. You can imagine. I don't think I could handle that either. So Darwin fled the operating area and refused to go back, and just went back home, said, "Nope, Dad, I'm not going to be a doctor. It's not going to happen." Well, his dad said, "Well, okay, we need to find a reputable occupation for you, young Charles." And so he sent him to Cambridge University to train to be a minister, with the idea that he would become a parish pastor, which was a highly respectable position at the time, and he would have plenty of free time to go and wander around and look at natural organisms, which is what he liked to do with his time. At Cambridge University, again, he still wasn't a great student, but he did put forth a little more effort than he had at the University of Edinburgh, and he made very good friends with some of his professors. And again, he was studying to be a minister, so some of his classes also included natural histories. So he learned about geology and science and things like that at Cambridge University, and he did manage to graduate, certainly not top of his class, but he did finish at Cambridge and graduated. Right about the time of graduation, he received an offer from, it was the military, so they were going to send out a ship called the HMS Beagle on a military expedition, and the point of the expedition was to go and map the coast of South America. So they wanted to map all along the coastline here in South America, and also take chronological measurements around the globe. So they were going to circle the globe after they'd mapped this coast, and so that was the purpose of the HMS Beagle. But it was very common at the time to send along a naturalist to collect different specimens and scientific information for them to bring back home and study. Well, several people had been approached to be the naturalist for the HMS Beagle. One gentleman had actually been hired and then changed his mind and decided no, he wasn't going on this trip. So they contacted Cambridge University and asked, well, do you have a young gentleman who would just have an interest in natural history and biology and specimens that you would recommend to go on this trip, not technically as a ship's naturalist, because he wasn't, I guess, qualified for that position, but instead as the captain's companion. The reason that they would send young gentlemen as a captain's companion was that at the time, because of the social structure of society, the captain was an upper class individual, and the whole crew of the ship would be just regular people, and they didn't socialize. So if you were upper class, you simply didn't talk to or socialize with anybody below your class in society. So captains were basically alone on the boat. And if you were going on a voyage for a very long period of time, it was fairly common for captains just to go crazy because they ate all their meals alone, they didn't have anybody to talk with, and they would just go a little bit nuts. Fitzroy especially had concerns about going a little bit nuts because he was related to a gentleman who had been a politician in England, and actually it was his uncle, so Fitzroy's uncle had been a politician, and Fitzroy's uncle actually wrote the treaty that separated or gave the border between the U.S. and Canada. So Fitzroy's uncle was the gentleman who wrote the treaty that established that border between the U.S. and Canada, and that's the longest, most peaceful border ever to exist in human history, and it was drawn up by Fitzroy's uncle. So he was a very successful man. Only problem with that was he suffered from bouts of severe depression and probably was bipolar. And at one point, when he was back home after he'd written his treaties and he was still just back home, his wife took all of the sharp things in the house over to a neighbor and didn't say why, just said, "You need to hold on to all of these things for me. I just don't want them in my house right now. Just hang on to all my sharp stuff." And Fitzroy's uncle happened to come across a penknife. So at the time they had to sharpen their pens, and there were these little itty bitty tiny knives to do that. Well, his wife must not have thought that that was enough to do much damage, but Fitzroy's uncle managed to slit his own throat with this itty bitty tiny little knife and commit suicide. So that had just been less than a year before Fitzroy got the offer to go and be captain of the HMS Beagle. Fitzroy, his entire life, had been told, "You're just like your uncle." He looked just like him, acted just like him, had the same bouts of depression, things like that, just like his uncle. So he was very concerned. His uncle had just lost it and committed suicide. He didn't want to go on this boat alone. So that was another really good reason to bring on a young gentleman for him to just be able to socialize with. So they offered the position to Darwin. One of his professors recommended him. And Darwin's father said, "No, you cannot go." In Darwin's father's eyes, he was a very strict gentleman, and he was very concerned about the family's reputation. The reason for that is his own father didn't have the best of reputations. Now, his father had been a doctor, so Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus, had been a doctor, a very good, very respectable doctor, except he also had some interesting characteristics. His wife had died, and they had several young children, and the nanny that he hired to watch over his young children also provided him with several more children that he acknowledged. Now, this is a man in his 50s with a teenage gal watching over his kids and giving him more children that he acknowledged were his kids and took care of them. He also, after that young woman left, he actually gave her money and set her up with a nice shop, and they remained friends. But after she left his household, he would get together with the neighbor lady, and they would write erotic poems. So basically that was the porn of the day, these poems that were very erotic. And so that was Erasmus Darwin. He was also a kind of a portly gentleman, very large, and he had his dining room table cut out in a half circle. So his dining room table, probably a square thing like this, but he had one end cut out in a half circle so that he could scooch right up, his chair right up into the table, and all of his food would be within easy reach. So kind of an eccentric fellow. And Darwin's dad did not want to continue that image with the family. So he himself was very respectable. Darwin had an older brother that was already an alcoholic who chased women and had a very bad reputation. So Darwin was the last chance for this family to be respectable. And the idea of Darwin running off on this military ship right after college was kind of the equivalent of you graduating college and going to mom and dad and saying, "Mom, Dad, I'm going to run off with a motorcycle gang. Can I have your support for that?" And so Darwin's father really didn't agree to that. Eventually it was Darwin's uncle, Emma Wedgwood's father, who he would later marry Emma, who convinced his dad to let him go on this expedition. So they left in December of 1831, and it was only supposed to be like a 2-3 year expedition. It ended up being 5 years, but they left from London and traveled down. They would go back and forth along the coast and map it, and while the ship was mapping, Darwin would get off of the boat every chance he got, and he would go exploring. So he would go inland, and he would spend weeks at a time off the boat exploring and collecting things. In fact, Darwin, every chance he got, he would get off the boat because he was seasick the entire time. A quote from him was, "I hate every wave of the ocean with a fever which you can never understand," or with a fervor that you can never understand. So Darwin just hated being on the boat, so he spent much of his time on land exploring. While he was on the voyage, he was reading the book Principles of Geology. Remember, that was by Charles Lyell. And in the book, it described how the Earth has been changing, is still changing, mountains and are growing and eroding, and all of this is occurring. And on the voyage in 1835 in Conception, Chile, it's actually where this kind of green circle is located right here, Darwin witnessed that. There was a terrible, terrible earthquake there, and he was in the area at the time, and he went and walked along this region of coast where the earthquake had occurred, and beds of fossils, or beds of clams that had been underwater that morning prior to the earthquake were now several feet above sea level up on land. So that land mass in that area had shifted upwards, and he actually saw that with his own eyes after this earthquake. And so that helped kind of with his observations, because later when he was up in the Andes Mountains, he would find marine fossils. So fossils of marine creatures way up in the Andes Mountains. And he had witnessed this earthquake raising the level of the land, and that supported what was stated in the Principles of Geology, that was very slow, gradual movements over long periods of time that form mountains and different things. Also on the Galapagos Islands, he collected 13 species of finch, among other things. So this yellow circle here shows the Galapagos Islands just off the coast here. Also, he would collect lots of different fossils on his expeditions. One of the fossils he collected was of an extinct organism called a glyptodont, and the glyptodont was huge. It would have been about the size of a Volkswagen Bug car. It was over 4,000 pounds, and they were extinct. They weren't found there anymore. Their fossils were very old, but in those same areas where these glyptodonts were common in the past, they now had these little tiny armadillos that looked the same, but were just miniature versions of the glyptodont. It was only about 10 pounds. So the idea that this huge creature had gradually over time gotten smaller occurred to him. Other influences on Darwin, a book written by Thomas Malthus, and Thomas Malthus actually wrote his book quite a few years before Darwin was even born, and Thomas's book was not about biology at all. It was an economics book, and this book was called Essay on the Principle of Population, where it showed that human populations in countries would grow geometrically. So this blue line is a geometric progression. However, the ability of the environment to produce food and increase food production grew arithmetically. And that's true even today. We can only grow food production arithmetically, whereas animal populations can increase geometrically. There's a problem there. The population can grow much faster than the food supply can. So what's going to happen at some point? Once your population outgrows your food supply, organisms in that population are going to start to starve to death. So reading Malthus's book, Darwin had his eureka moment. So suddenly it struck him, well, organisms have to struggle to survive. There's a limited food supply. So favorable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavorable ones would be destroyed. And so that was the basis of his idea of genetic change over time. And so he started writing up his idea, and this is after his voyage, he's back home, was writing up his ideas, what he saw, his observations, and incorporating this favorable variations being preserved into that. And by 1842, he had a decent manuscript describing how he thought evolution occurred. And he's still a young man at this time, in his late 20s, and he wrote a letter to his wife telling her, well, if I should suddenly die, and most people don't, consider that they're going to suddenly die in their late 20s, I would like you to take, and it was a fairly substantial sum of money, this amount of money, and publish this manuscript. It's very important to me, and if I should, not publish it before I die, please publish this. And that was only 6 years after the voyage. He was not ready to publish his ideas because what he had to say of organisms changing based on those favorable variations was totally against what most people, even in the scientific community, supported. And this is in another letter he wrote, "At last gleams of light have come, and I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not," and it's like confessing to murder, "immutable." Immutable means unchangeable. So it was like confessing that he had just killed somebody to even write to one of his best friends and tell them he thought species changed over time, that they were not immutable. So this was really not an idea that the scientific community supported at the time. Darwin was finally prompted to publish in 1859, and what happened in 1859, he had been in communication with a young man named Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace had been traveling and collecting specimens very similar to what Darwin had done many, many years earlier. The difference was that Darwin was on a military ship, and he was wealthy. He paid his own way on the ship, but he had money to buy all the gear he needed, all the food he needed. It was a military expedition, so he had armed guards wherever he needed them. Wallace, however, was not of the gentleman class. He was fairly poor, didn't have any money, didn't really have any way to support himself. He was doing this all on his own, and he would go and travel. He went through the Amazon rainforest and different places like that, and he would collect specimens, and he would send them back home to sell to tourists and different institutions to help fund his expeditions. And so he was doing this basically all on his own without any support. He got sick with yellow fever and malaria on several occasions. In fact, his own brother had gone with him and died from yellow fever on one of their expeditions. He'd been in a shipwreck where he almost died, and he lost all of his specimens, and even live animals that he'd been carting through the rainforest with him were on the ship, and that was all lost. And so he had a really tough time of it. He actually wrote a book about his travels, a really good kind of explorer's book to read. Very interesting information in it. But he had also read Malthus's book when he was a young man. When he was a young man, he lived in a tough part of the city, and he was bullied a lot, and the local bookstore would allow him to hang out in there and basically hide from the bullies, and he would read books. And so he had read Malthus's books many years before about population and food supply, and he was actually in the midst of a malarial fever. Now, malaria is awful. It causes awful muscle cramps, hallucinations. Basically, you're delusional while you're fighting off malaria. And he was in one of these delusional fevers, and it struck him that, hey, this Malthus's idea, and that things struggle to survive, and all of his observations, very similar to Darwin's, so species must change over time. He actually, while he was still feverish, got out of bed and wrote up his ideas, and then he had to wait till he recovered from malaria to read his ideas again to figure out if it made any sense, because he wasn't sure. But once he'd kind of read over his notes again, he sent that information in a letter to Darwin. And he told Darwin, publish it only if you think it's worthy. Darwin was crushed. Remember, he had gone on the voyage and written his manuscript within 6 years. But then he spent the next 20 almost years gathering evidence. He wrote a whole series of books on barnacles and their life history, and he'd done a lot of other research, was a very well-known scientist at the time, but he just hadn't published the evolution ideas yet. All his originality would be smashed, and it wasn't without precedent. Another friend of Darwin's had several years earlier stolen one of his ideas and published before him, and he was just devastated. He didn't know what to do. Here he'd spent 20 years of his life developing this idea and supporting it, and Wallace's ideas were so similar that he almost word for word was writing the same thing Darwin had in his manuscript that he had written and put in a drawer and had been sitting in that drawer for about 16 years. Darwin just didn't know what to do. He wanted to be fair, but he didn't know what to do, so Darwin pulled out his manuscript, gave it to a friend of his that had seen it before, and also gave him Wallace's letter and said, "You figure out what to do with this. I can't do anything with it right now." The reason Darwin was so overwhelmed and couldn't do anything with it is his young son, his infant son, was very, very sick. And so he just wanted to focus on being there for his son. His friend took Darwin's manuscript and Wallace's letter and actually presented them jointly at a scientific conference there in London, so got the ideas both out there together, presented them at the same time, and so gave them both equal credit for it. Darwin was not at the conference because he was actually attending his son's funeral that day. After the conference, his friends encouraged him, "Well, collect the rest of your notes and go ahead and finish your book. Your idea is out there. People know that you and Wallace have this idea, so go ahead and write your book." So he collected his notes, and in November of 1859, this is 23 years after he got back from the voyage, so he had been working on notes. In fact, we still have his series of notebooks. He carried around a notebook all the time and just would add little notes and information about the idea of evolution, and all the experiments he did at home and all the experiments his friends did and told him about. So he had 23 years worth of research supporting his ideas. It sold out the first day and has been in print ever since. The full title of Darwin's book is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. But now we've shortened it to The Origin of Species, or just The Origin, and we know what you're talking about. Before this book came out, there were a lot of beliefs, and even by science. So everything was put on Earth all at the same time. Nothing changed, nothing added, nothing lost. The Earth is only 6,000 years old, and the Earth is mostly unchanging. After 1859, when this was published, organisms change over time. Some have gone extinct. The Earth is much older than 6,000 years old, and geology of Earth is not constant, but always changing. And we know more and more about this. At Darwin's time in 1859, we didn't know about tectonic plates and how they moved around the Earth and the continents drifting. And we can even measure that today using satellites and other technology like GPS. So all of these were kind of brand new ideas, but the scientific community, within just a few years, had accepted all of this. And really, there's been no debate in science on this information since then. However, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and people in general haven't always come around to that idea quite yet. Darwin's book started with a thorough description of pigeon breeding. So these are all different types of pigeons. So I've seen all of these. My in-laws breed pigeons, and this one's really cute. It's got feathers growing straight up around its head. You have to dig through those feathers to even find the poor little pigeon head. This one, it's supposed to have that weird gnarly stuff on its beak. I think it's really ugly, but my mother-in-law loves those kinds of pigeons. I don't know why. Other, different shapes of the pigeon body, different feathers. This one just has kind of a ruffle around instead of the full feathers covering its head. This one is really cute. It puffs up its tail behind it like a fan, and puffs out its chest and hoots at you and struts around. So all these different pigeons were developed by humans, just by picking a male and female pigeon that maybe had a weird feather sticking up at its neck and breeding them together, and then picking offspring that had weird feathers until they got some of these different effects. And if you look at pigeon breeding books, there are basically recipes for how to get all of these different characteristics. You start with just regular pigeons and what to look for and how to get all these different types of birds. So he started with a thorough description of that, what humans already do, and it's been done in lots of domesticated animals, and he called that artificial selection. So whenever humans were deciding what to breed together to produce different agricultural plants and animals, different pets, plants and animals, that humans could breed and select for different traits and characteristics. An extreme example of that is dogs. So this is a Saint Bernard, and they're huge. And this is a Shih Tzu, certainly much, much smaller, but they're both dogs, and recognizably dogs. Humans got these two different types of dogs by breeding together larger and larger dogs for the Saint Bernard and smaller dogs with different traits for the Shih Tzu. And a video that's also in kind of this lecture section of Blackboard, just scroll down and watch the Artificial Selection in Dogs video. In fact, I'd suggest you pause this video now and go and watch that and then come back. Darwin proposed that because we can do this so easily with pigeons and corn and soybeans and garden flowers and dogs and cats, that this could happen in nature. Only instead of humans selecting which two to breed together, it happened naturally. So natural selection, based on which organisms were able to find food. Remember that struggle for food? Not only food, but space and a reproductive partner, and be able to reproduce. And so natural selection occurs in a variety of species, from turtles to finches, and these are some finch on the Galapagos Islands, and the birds look very similar. The differences in their beaks. The main differences in their beaks, and since birds use their beaks to get food, their different food sources would dictate their different types of beaks. In turtles, you can even tell, and this is different turtles on the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands is a collection of small islands with sea in between each of them. And each island has a slightly different climate and vegetation just because of where it's located. And a local person can tell you what island each turtle is from based on the shape of its shell. And this person's here just to show how big these turtles are. In fact, Darwin would ride them around the island. He said it was really hard to sit on them because they would lumber around and knock him off, but they were just huge animals. Some islands don't have much vegetation on the ground. They're rocky, kind of desert-like, and those turtles have saddleback shells that go up. So these turtles will feed by reaching up into shrubs and short trees to eat the leaves. Other islands have lots of vegetation at ground level, so they just have regular shells that don't allow them to reach up, and they just eat the vegetation on the ground. So they're adapted to their own individual environments. So Darwin's idea, remember we talked about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and his idea of stretching and stretching and stretching the necks. Well, Darwin's idea said, well, it doesn't happen through experience. It exists already when selection acts on it. So you have a population of giraffes, and just by natural variation, some individuals have slightly longer and some have slightly shorter necks. And you can see that even with humans. If we took everybody in your class or everybody that you know and measured the length of their necks, humans have variation. So some are shorter and some are longer necked humans. Doesn't really affect us much, but if you're a giraffe and you have a longer neck, you have access to more food because you can reach up higher. You can still reach all these lower leaves, but especially in dry years where there's not much food around, you have an advantage because now you can reach more food. This giraffe may not get enough to reproduce or even survive, so the slightly longer necked giraffe will reproduce and pass that DNA on to their offspring, again with some variation in neck length. Over many, 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 many generations, we end up with the giraffes we know today.